The letter arrived 18 years too late, but Clara Whitfield didn't know that. She climbed down from the wagon, holding it with both hands, hair plastered against her face from 3 days of rain, and she walked straight up to the man splitting wood in the yard like she had every right in the world to be there. "Mr. Caleb Mercer," she said. Her voice didn't shake. "I've come a very long way. I believe you sent for me." Caleb set the axe down slowly. He looked at the letter. Then he looked at her. "I've never written a letter in my life." If this story already has your heart, subscribe to our channel, follow until the very last word, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Caleb Mercer did not go looking for trouble. Trouble had a long history of finding him anyway. It was a Tuesday. Not that the day of the week meant much to a man who hadn't owned a calendar in 6 years. He measured time differently now. By how deep the frost cut into the morning air. By how many fence posts needed replacing before the first real snow. By how long it took for the silence inside the cabin to stop feeling like a person missing and start feeling like just silence. It hadn't started feeling like just silence yet. 18 years was a long time to wait for something to stop hurting. Caleb had more or less made peace with the fact that it never would. He was out back splitting wood when he heard the wagon. He heard it before he saw it. The groan of iron-rimmed wheels against frozen ground. The blow of a horse working harder than it should have to the particular creak of a loaded rig coming up a grade. He didn't put down the axe right away. Wagons came up the ridge road sometimes. Lost travelers. The occasional supply man who'd taken a wrong turn. They usually figured out their mistake and turned around without bothering him. This one didn't turn around. He heard it pull into the yard. He heard it stop. Then he heard boots on frozen ground. Light boots, a woman's boots, and he put the axe down. She was standing in the middle of his yard when he came around the corner of the cabin, holding an envelope in both hands like it was something precious or something dangerous, and she looked at him with eyes that had clearly not slept properly in days. Her coat was good quality. Chicago quality, he'd think later, but it was soaked through and caked with road mud along the hem. Her hair was dark and damp and coming loose from whatever she'd tried to do with it. She was younger than he expected, though he hadn't expected anyone at all. She didn't look away when she saw him. He gave her credit for that. Most people took one look at Caleb Mercer and found somewhere else to direct their eyes. "Mr. Caleb Mercer," she said. "Depends on who's asking." "My name is Clara Whitfield." She extended the envelope toward him. "I've come a very long way. I believe you sent for me." He looked at the envelope. He didn't take it. "I've never written a letter in my life." Something crossed her face, not quite panic, but the thing that comes just before panic when a person is too exhausted to feel it properly yet. She pushed the envelope closer. "Please, just read it." He took it. Not because he believed her, but because she was clearly about to fall down, and something in him, something he'd thought was long dead, found he didn't want to watch that happen. The letter was on good paper. His name was at the top. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, someone who'd thought about each word. It laid out an arrangement, a mail-order arrangement, the kind Caleb had heard other men in other circumstances enter into, and at the bottom was a signature. Caleb Mercer, Mercer Ridge, Utah Territory. He read it twice. "This isn't my handwriting," he said. "It has your name on it. Lots of things can have a name on them." He folded the letter and held it back out to her. "That doesn't mean I wrote it." She didn't take it. She was staring at him with something happening behind her eyes, the careful, methodical collapse of a plan she had built her entire immediate future on. He watched her work through it. He watched her refuse to let it show. "How long did you travel?" he asked. Not because he particularly wanted to know, but because she looked like someone needed to ask her something human. 11 days, she said. From Chicago. 11 days. On the strength of a letter this man standing in front of her had never written. "Is there anyone else coming?" he asked. "With the wagon." "The driver." She gestured back at the road. "He's waiting to know if he should unload my trunk." Caleb looked at the wagon. He looked at the woman. He looked at the gray sky pressing down over the ridge, carrying a smell that meant serious weather by nightfall. "Tell him to wait," he said. He walked back inside the cabin. He stood in the middle of the kitchen for a moment, with the letter in his hand, looking at it like it might explain itself if he waited long enough. The kitchen was the room he spent most of his time in, not because it was comfortable, but because it was functional, and function was what he'd reduced his life to. There was a table with 2 chairs, which had always struck him as a cruelty, since he'd been the only one using it for 18 years. There was a stove he kept burning from October through March. There were no curtains on the windows, because he'd never seen the need. Sarah had wanted curtains. He put that thought back where it lived and focused on the letter. Someone had gone to considerable trouble. Someone had obtained good paper. Someone had known his name, his location, enough details to make a woman travel 11 days across the country on the strength of it. Someone had forged his signature well enough that even he had to look twice to be certain it wasn't his. Someone had done all of that with a purpose. He just didn't know what the purpose was yet. He went back outside. She was standing exactly where he'd left her, which told him something. A woman with options would have done something. Climbed back on the wagon, paced the yard, demanded an explanation. Clara Whitfield stood still with the expression of a person who had learned that stillness was safer than motion. "Come inside," he said. She didn't move immediately. "Is that—" "It's going to snow," he said. "You look like you haven't eaten since Denver. Come inside." She came inside. He heated water. He found the bread he'd baked 2 days ago and cut it without being asked. He set a cup in front of her and stood at the stove with his back to her, because having a person at his kitchen table felt strange in a way he didn't have adequate language for, and he found it easier to talk if he wasn't looking directly at the situation. "Tell me about the letter," he said. "How it came to you." She wrapped both hands around the cup. He could hear her steadying herself. "It came through the agency," she said. "The Whitmore Correspondence Agency, in Chicago. I had registered with them several months ago." She paused. "The letter arrived under your name. It described the ranch, the location. It said you were looking for a wife who wasn't afraid of hard work, who could manage a household, who understood that life in the territory wasn't what a person read about in novels." Another pause. "I thought it sounded honest. Most of the letters I'd received through the agency were not honest." "How so?" "Men describing themselves as prosperous when they were destitute. Describing themselves as widowers when they had families they'd abandoned. One man described himself as a devout churchgoer and a kind soul. He was neither." She said it flatly, without self-pity. "Your letter was different. It didn't promise anything romantic. It just said what the life was and asked if I could handle it." Caleb turned slightly. "And you thought you could?" "I know I can." No hesitation. "That wasn't the question I was asking myself." He waited. "I was asking myself whether I had anything better to go to." She looked up at him with those direct, exhausted eyes. "I didn't." It was the most honest thing anyone had said to him in longer than he could measure. He turned back to the stove and gave himself a moment with it. "The letter is forged," he said. "I understand that now. Somebody went to a great deal of trouble to get you here. I understand that too." Her voice was careful, controlled. "What I don't understand is why." "Neither do I." He turned around then, and he looked at her properly for the first time. She held his gaze without flinching. "But I intend to find out." Outside, the snow had started. By the time the wagon driver had been paid and sent back down the ridge carrying strict instructions from Caleb about which road to take, before the storm made the lower grade impassable, the world beyond the cabin windows had gone white and quiet, in the particular way of a Utah mountain winter. That means everything has stopped. Clara's trunk was sitting in the front room. They both looked at it. "There's a room at the back," Caleb said. "It hasn't been used." He stopped. He started again. "It has a bed. A good one. It's cold, but the stove will carry the heat back there in a few hours." "Thank you," she said. "This is temporary," he said. "I want to be clear about that." "I understand. You're not what you were told you'd be. There's been a mistake made, and I don't know yet by who or why. But until I do, it doesn't make sense to send you back into weather like this." "I understand," she said again. He picked up her trunk. It was heavier than it looked, and carried it down the short hall to the back room. He set it down and lit the lamp on the bedside table, and stood for a moment in a room he hadn't entered in almost 2 decades. Sarah's needlework was still on the wall. He'd never taken it down, because taking it down would have required standing in this room, and he'd made it this far by not doing that. He left before Clara could see his face. "Dr. Nang." She was quiet at supper. He was always quiet, that wasn't a change. But her quiet had a different quality than his. His quiet was the quiet of a man who had forgotten what to say. Hers was the quiet of a woman deciding what was safe to say. He found himself curious about that line she was drawing. Found himself wondering what lived on the other side of it. "You said you had nothing better to go to," he said, not looking up from his plate. She didn't answer immediately. He'd learned in those few hours that Clara Whitfield didn't answer things immediately. She thought first. He respected that. "I had a situation in Chicago," she said finally. "I'd rather not call it a scandal, but other people have been less polite about it. I'm not asking for details." "I know." She looked at him. "I'm just explaining why a woman with no connections to the Utah territory would get on a wagon based on a letter she received through a correspondence agency." "She had nowhere else to go," he said. "She had nowhere else that was far enough." A pause. Distance was the point. He understood that. He understood it in a way that didn't require explanation. He had chosen Mercer Ridge 18 years ago, partly for exactly that reason. You couldn't be found by what you were running from if you put enough mountain between yourself and it. "Get some rest," he said. "Storm will run through by morning. After that, we'll figure out what to do next." She nodded and pushed back from the table, and she took her plate to the basin without being asked, and she washed it, and she went down the hall to the back room, and the cabin got quiet again. But it wasn't the same quiet as before. He sat at the table for a long time after, with his hands around a cup that had gone cold, listening to a silence that had a different shape in it now. A shape where a person was down the hall breathing. He'd forgotten what that felt like. He wasn't sure how he felt about remembering. He didn't sleep well. He never slept well. But that night, it was different. Not the old restless grief that had become almost comfortable in its familiarity, but something else, something more immediate. Questions running like water. Who had sent the letter? Who had known enough about him to forge it convincingly? Who had known about the Whitmore Agency, about mail-order arrangements, about the kind of woman who might respond to an honest letter from a solitary man in the Utah mountains? He ran through names. It was not a long list. Caleb Mercer's life had shed people steadily since Sarah died. Some had left on their own, unable to maintain a friendship with a man who had removed himself so completely from the business of being human. Some he had pushed away deliberately in the years when pushing felt like the only power he had left. One name kept surfacing: Jonas Miller. He put it away. Jonas was his oldest friend, his only remaining friend, if friend was still the right word for a man you saw 3 times a year and thought about more than you'd ever admit. Jonas ran the feed store in Clearwater and had been trying to get Caleb off the ridge and back among living people for going on a decade. He put the name away again. In the morning, Clara was already in the kitchen when he came out. She had found the coffee. She had started a fire in the stove, a good fire, well laid, the kind a person made who knew what they were doing, and not the kind that someone unfamiliar with a wood stove produced. She was standing at the window with a cup in her hand, looking at the white world the storm had left behind. She didn't startle when he came in. She heard him and turned and said, "There's coffee," in a tone that suggested she understood he would have preferred to be the one to make it, and was neither apologizing for nor defending her choice. He poured a cup. "The road will be passable by midday," he said. "All right. I'm going down to Clearwater to ask some questions." She turned from the window. About the letter. Yes. Can I come? He hadn't expected that. He looked at her for a moment, this woman standing in his kitchen in yesterday's clothes with dark circles under direct eyes asking to accompany him into a situation she didn't understand in a territory she'd never seen before 3 days ago. Why? He asked. Because it was my name on the bottom of a forged document too, she said. My signature on whatever reply the agency sent back. Whoever did this used both of us. She set down her cup. I have as much right to the answer as you do. He couldn't argue with that. We leave in an hour, he said. Bawad. The road down off Mercer Ridge was hard going after a night's snow. The horses knew it. He knew it. And Clara sat beside him on the wagon bench, without complaint, through 40 minutes of difficult ground. She held on when she needed to hold on, and she didn't make any noise about it, and she didn't fill the silence with talking the way most people did when they were nervous. He found he didn't mind her being there. That realization arrived quietly, and he chose not to examine it closely. Clearwater was a town of approximately 400 people arranged around a main road, with ambitions of becoming more than it was. He'd lived 30 miles from it for 18 years, and knew maybe a dozen people in it well enough to nod at. He pulled the wagon up in front of Miller's Feed and Supply, and he set the brake, and he looked at the front door for a moment. You know who did it? Clara said. It wasn't a question. He'd been watching her in small ways since morning. The way she noticed things assembled them, drew conclusions quietly, and waited to see if she was right before saying anything out loud. She was watching him the same way. I think I might, he said. Then why did we need to come down here? Couldn't you have... Because I need to hear him say it, Caleb said. And I need to see his face when he does. He climbed down from the wagon. After a moment, she climbed down too. They went inside together. Jonas Miller was a big man with red hands and an open face that had never in 60 years of life learned to conceal what he was feeling. He was behind the counter when the bell above the door announced them, and he looked up with the automatic welcome expression of a man who'd run a shop for 30 years. And then he saw Caleb. And then he saw the woman beside Caleb, and every bit of color left his face. In 18 years of watching people try to hide things from him, Caleb had never seen a man go guilty that fast. Caleb, Jonas said. Jonas. Caleb set both hands on the counter and looked at his oldest friend. You want to tell me something? Jonas looked at Clara, then back at Caleb, then at a point somewhere above and between them, in the way of a man rapidly calculating whether any exit still existed. There was no exit. Who is she? Jonas asked, though his voice already knew. Her name is Clara Whitfield, Caleb said. She came 11 days from Chicago on the strength of a letter I never wrote. A letter that had my name on it, my location, my life. He let that sit for a moment. A letter that came through the Whitmore Correspondence Agency, which is the kind of specific detail a man would only know if he'd done some research. Jonas was quiet. I've been trying, Caleb said, and his voice was very even, to think of anyone in the world who would know enough about my life to forge that letter convincingly. And I keep coming back to one name. The shop was silent. Outside, a wagon passed on the road. Somewhere in the back, a mouse ran along a baseboard. Jonas Miller looked at his oldest friend across the counter and said with the expression of a man who knows exactly how much trouble he's in and has known it was coming for some time. I did it because you were already dead in that cabin, Caleb. You just hadn't stopped breathing yet. Clara made a sound small, sharp, involuntary beside him. Caleb didn't move. Didn't look away from Jonas. Didn't let his face do what it wanted to do. You, he said very quietly, are going to explain yourself. Right now. Every word of it. And Jonas Miller, 60 years old and red-handed and looking suddenly much smaller behind his counter, took a breath and began. Jonas didn't start with an apology. That was the first thing Caleb noticed. A guilty man who wanted forgiveness would have opened with sorry, would have leaned across the counter and put his hand out and said, I'm sorry, Caleb. I'm sorry. Let me explain. Jonas didn't do any of that. He came around the counter, walked to the front door, turned the lock, and flipped the sign to closed. Then he pulled 2 chairs from beside the wall and set them in the middle of the floor, and looked at Clara and looked at Caleb and said, "Sit down." Caleb didn't sit. Clara didn't either. "All right," Jonas said. "Stand then." He lowered himself into one of the chairs like a man whose knees had given up arguing with the rest of him. "You want the whole story or just the part that makes you want to hit me?" "Start talking," Caleb said. "I'll decide as you go." Jonas laced his hands together and looked at them for a moment, the gesture of a man organizing something he'd been rehearsing for a long time and was only now realizing no rehearsal was adequate. "It started 8 months ago," he said. "I came up to the ridge to bring you the salt order you never picked up. You remember that February? Coldest February in 6 years. He didn't wait for confirmation. You didn't answer when I knocked. I went around back and found you in the barn. You'd been in there for 2 days. Didn't eat. Didn't sleep. Just sat with your back against the stall wall in the cold." He paused. "You didn't even look up when I came in. You just said, 'Go home, Jonas,' like I was someone who'd interrupted something." Caleb said nothing. "I drove back down that ridge," Jonas continued, "and I sat in this shop for 3 days, and I couldn't get your face out of my head, the way you looked. Like a man who'd already decided something and was just waiting for his body to catch up." He looked up at Caleb directly. "I've known you for 40 years, Caleb Mercer. I know what your face looks like when you're grieving. What I saw in that barn wasn't grief. It was surrender." The word landed in the room like a stone into still water. Clara was very still beside Caleb. He was aware of her in his peripheral vision, not moving, barely breathing, listening with the particular attention of someone who understood they were hearing something that mattered deeply, even though none of it was about them. "So you forged a letter," Caleb said. His voice was flat, not angry yet, just flat. "I thought about it for 2 months," Jonas said. "I talked myself out of it a dozen times. Then I talked myself back into it." He shifted in the chair. "I knew about the Whitmore agency. My cousin's boy used it, found himself a good woman out of Ohio, been married 7 years. I knew what kind of letter they needed. So I wrote one. I tried to write it the way you would have written it if you were capable of—" He stopped. "If you hadn't shut yourself down so completely that you couldn't see you needed something." "You had no right," Caleb said. "No," Jonas agreed. "I didn't. You used her." Caleb's voice shifted, not louder but harder, which was worse. "You sent her 11 days across the country on a lie, without her knowledge, without her consent. She made a decision based on, 'I know what I did.' Do you—" Caleb took one step toward him. "She sold things, Jonas. She left a city. She—" He stopped because he didn't actually know everything she'd left. He turned to Clara. Tell him what you did to get here." Clara was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was composed in the way of someone who had made a decision to not give people the satisfaction of watching her break. "I sold my mother's jewelry," she said, "to have enough for the agency fee and the travel. I gave up my room at the boarding house. I told my landlady I was getting married." She paused. "I wrote to the 2 friends I had left and told them I had found a good man in the Utah Territory and I was going to build something new." She looked at Jonas with eyes that were not angry, which was somehow more devastating than anger. "They were happy for me. They said I deserved it." Jonas looked like a man who had thought he understood the consequence of what he'd done and was only now learning the actual weight of it. "Miss Whitfield," he started. "Don't," she said quietly. He closed his mouth. "I have one question," she said. "Just one, and then I'd like you to answer it honestly, because I think I've earned at least that." She waited until he met her eyes. "Did you know anything about me before you chose my name from the agency registry? Or was I just the first file they handed you?" Jonas looked genuinely stricken. "I read every file," he said. "It took me 3 weeks. I read all of them. I looked for someone who—" He stopped. He tried again. "I looked for someone who understood hard living. Someone who wasn't going out west because she thought it was going to be beautiful. Someone who had already been through something and come out of it still standing. He held her gaze. Your letter to the agency described a woman who had made mistakes and survived them and wasn't looking for rescue. Just ground to stand on. Something shifted in Clara's face, very slight, very controlled, and she looked away. Caleb watched her look away. He filed that away somewhere he didn't look at directly. You still had no right, he said to Jonas, to either of us. I know it. Jonas stood up. His knees cracked. He was an old man, Caleb thought, not for the first time, but in a way that registered differently than usual. Jonas was old, and Caleb was not young, and 18 years had passed on Mercer Ridge while the world outside had gone on moving without him. I know it, and I'm not asking you to forgive me today. I'm just asking you to hear me out fully before you drive back up that mountain and go back to dying slowly in that cabin. I am not. You are, Jonas said. Simple, no cruelty in it. Just the flat truth of a man who had watched someone he loved disappear by degrees for nearly 2 decades. You've been doing it since Sarah died, and you know it as well as I do. You just won't say it out loud, because saying it out loud would mean you have to do something about it. Caleb's jaw worked. He didn't speak. She was one woman, Jonas said. Sarah was one woman, and she was good, and she was yours, and what happened to her was wrong and terrible. But she's been gone 18 years, Caleb. 18 years. And you have just been up there. His voice finally cracked just slightly. You have just been up there alone, and every time I come to see you, there's less of you than there was before. Like a fire that keeps burning, but there's no more wood going in. Eventually, it just goes out. The shop was very quiet. Clara had moved to the window without either of them noticing. She was looking out at the road, giving them what space a small room could offer. Caleb looked at his oldest friend and felt something move in his chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, and not understanding, but something in between. Something that didn't have a clean name. You should have talked to me, he said finally. You should have just talked to me. I talked to you for 16 years, Caleb. Jonas met his gaze without flinching. You were very polite about not hearing a word of it. They didn't stay long after that. There was more to say. There was probably years more to say, but Caleb had reached the edge of what he could absorb in one morning, and he recognized the feeling and knew from experience that pushing past it produced nothing useful. He told Jonas they'd talk again. He didn't say when. On the walk back to the wagon, Clara said nothing. He helped her up to the bench. Not because she needed it. He suspected she didn't need it, but because it was there to do, and he climbed up after and released the brake, and turned the horses back toward the ridge road. They were a quarter-mile out of town before she spoke. He loves you, she said. In the way people love each other when they've known each other long enough to stop pretending. Caleb kept his eyes on the road. That doesn't make what he did right, he said. No, she agreed. But it explains it. Those aren't the same thing. A pause. In my experience, most of the worst things people do to each other come from exactly that kind of love. The kind where someone decides they know better what you need than you do. He glanced at her. She was looking straight ahead. That sounds personal, he said. Everything sounds personal when it is. She pulled her coat tighter against the cold. In Chicago, the man who caused my situation, he thought he was protecting me. He thought he was making a decision I wasn't capable of making for myself. A short, humorless sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Funny how that works. The people who take your choices away always believe they're doing it for you. Caleb thought about that for a long mile. What happened? He asked. In Chicago. I thought you said you didn't need details. I didn't need them this morning, he said. I'm asking now. She looked at him for a moment with those measuring eyes. Deciding. He'd come to recognize the process already, the slight pause, the interior assessment, the verdict. I worked for a man named Gerald Harmon, she said. He ran an investment firm, legitimate mostly. I managed correspondence, kept his books in order, handled things he didn't want his name directly attached to. A pause. I was good at it. Better than he was at most of it, truthfully, though I was smart enough not to say so. Another pause. And then I found something in the books I wasn't supposed to find. Money moving in ways that didn't make sense unless you were looking for it. Small amounts from a great many people, widows mostly, and pensioners being funneled through accounts that disappeared. Caleb's hands tightened slightly on the reins. I went to him with it, Clara said. Privately. I thought... She stopped. I thought he didn't know. I thought someone else in the firm was responsible, and he'd want to know. And I thought that because I was 26 years old and still believed that men in positions of authority generally meant to do right. Her voice was perfectly steady. He told me I was mistaken. He told me I had misread the accounts. He told me that if I continued to misread accounts in the way I had been misreading them, he would have to let me go, and also mention to anyone who asked that I had a tendency toward hysterical misinterpretations. He threatened you, Caleb said. He did more than that. She looked out at the mountain road ahead of them. He had me dismissed from every position I tried to find after that. Nothing provable, just a quiet word here, a letter there. Chicago is a large city, but the class of men who employ women like me is not a large class. A beat. I spent 8 months unable to find work. I spent my savings. I sold my mother's jewelry. She said the last part without emphasis, though it clearly cost something. And then I saw an advertisement for the Whitmore Agency in a newspaper, and I thought distance. I thought if I go far enough, none of that follows. And instead, Caleb said, you arrived at another mess. Yes. A long pause. Though this one is considerably more honest about itself so far. Something about the way she said it, dry, clear-eyed, the observation of a woman who had decided to find the precise true thing about every situation instead of flinching from it, made him want to smile. He didn't, but he wanted to. We'll figure out the next step when we're back, he said. There are options. I have some money set aside, enough to get you back to Chicago or wherever you'd want to go. Somewhere you could... I don't want to go back to Chicago, she said. Simply. No drama in it. And I'm not asking for your money, Mr. Mercer. Then what are you asking for? She turned and looked at him fully, and for a moment the only sound was the horses and the wind and the creak of the wagon on the frozen road. A few days, she said. To think. To not be in motion for the first time in 2 weeks. She held his gaze steadily. And maybe to be useful if there's anything on that ranch that needs doing. I don't sit well. He thought about the fence line on the south pasture that had needed attention since August. He thought about the roof on the barn where 2 boards had shifted in the October wind. He thought about the inside of the cabin, which ran exactly to his functional standards and no others, and how it had looked through Clara Whitfield's eyes this morning when she stood in his kitchen and started a fire without being asked. There's always something that needs doing, he said. Then I'll earn my days, she said. And after that we'll see. It was not a plan. It was barely an agreement. It was 2 people in a wagon on a mountain road making a small, careful decision not to decide anything larger than they had to right now. For the first time in 18 years, Caleb Mercer did not find the immediate future entirely without interest. He told himself that was just the unresolved question of who had sent the letter and why. He almost believed it. Back on the ridge, the afternoon moved differently than mornings on Mercer Ridge usually moved. Clara changed into work clothes. He heard her moving in the back room, heard the trunk open, and she came out in a dress that had clearly seen actual labor before, and she went directly to the front room and started taking stock. Not cleaning, not rearranging, just moving through the space with her eyes, the way a person does when they're making a mental inventory of what needs doing and in what order. The boards under the east window are soft, she said. I know. That means there's water getting in somewhere above it. I know that too. Do you have lumber? He looked at her. In the barn. I'll look at it after supper. She moved toward the kitchen. What do you have that's edible? Whatever's in the larder. She opened the larder and stood looking into it with an expression that managed to convey a great deal without saying anything unkind about his provisions. "I can make something with this," she said. "Don't interpret that as a comment on your housekeeping." "I wasn't going to." "You were thinking it." He almost smiled again. She cooked. He went out and did the afternoon rounds, horses, cattle in the north pasture, the check on the water line that ran from the upper creek down to the barn that he'd been nursing through the winter for 3 years. The routine was the same as every other day. His hands knew every piece of it without his mind having to attend. But his mind was elsewhere. It kept returning to the feed store, to Jonas's face, to the specific words, "You were already dead in that cabin, you just hadn't stopped breathing yet." He'd been furious when Jonas said it. He was still furious. But fury and truth weren't mutually exclusive, and Caleb had always been too honest with himself for his own comfort, and the honesty was working on him now in the cold air out among the cattle where there was nothing to distract from it. When had he last wanted something? Not needed was easy. Survival produced needs automatically. But wanted. When had he last found himself curious about what came next? He couldn't answer that. He came back to the cabin as the light was failing. The smell of food hit him at the door. Actual food, not the functional sustenance he prepared for himself, and something tight in his chest loosened slightly without his permission. "Sit down," Clara said from the stove, in exactly the tone he'd used that morning, and the echo of it was so precise that he almost laughed out loud. He sat down. She put a bowl in front of him. He looked at it. He looked at her. "It's just stew," she said, sitting across from him. "Don't make it larger than it is." "I wasn't going to." "You were doing the thing with your face." "I don't have a thing with my face. Everyone has a thing with their face," she said, picking up her spoon. "Yours is a kind of suspended surprise, like something happened that you didn't prepare for, and you're deciding whether to let yourself react to it." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's very specific," he said. "I told you I'm observant." She met his eyes briefly. "It was useful in my previous occupation, knowing what people's faces were actually saying while their mouths were saying something else." He picked up his spoon. They ate. The fire in the stove ticked and popped. Wind moved along the eaves outside. The cabin was warm, and there was food on the table, and across from him a woman with dark circles under direct eyes was eating stew and not filling the silence with noise. It was the most ordinary thing that had happened to Caleb Mercer in 18 years. He had no idea what to do with it. "Tomorrow," she said, setting down her spoon, "I'd like to look at that south fence line. The cattle will push through it before spring if the posts aren't reset." "How do you know about south fence lines?" "My uncle had a farm in Indiana," she said. "I spent 4 summers there as a girl. I know which end of a post driver to hold." She pushed back from the table and stood. "I also know how to reshingle a barn roof if you have nails and someone willing to hold the ladder." He watched her take her bowl to the basin. "Clara," he said. She stopped. It was the first time he'd used her given name. He hadn't planned to. It had arrived in his mouth before the decision was made. She waited. "What Jonas did was wrong," he said, "and I'm going to be angry about it for a while yet. But you—" He stopped. He chose his words carefully, the way he always chose things that required care. "You don't owe me anything for this. I want to be clear about that. Whatever comes next, it's your choice, not an obligation." She stood very still for a moment. "Thank you," she said, not effusively, just the fact of it received and acknowledged. She went down the hall to the back room. He sat at the table for a long while after in the warm cabin with the fire burning down, and the wind moving outside, and the sound faint, and impossible, and yet completely real of someone breathing down the hall. Something was changing on Mercer Ridge. He could feel it moving under everything, the way you feel a river moving under ice, slow and powerful, and not yet visible, but there, definitely there. He was not sure whether to be afraid of it. He was not sure he wasn't. She was up before him again. He'd half expected that after the first morning, had told himself it wouldn't happen twice that she'd sleep late, the way people did, when they were catching up on exhaustion, that the rhythm of the ranch would take time to settle into her body, the way it had settled into his over decades. He was wrong. He came out of his room at first light, and the stove was already burning, and the coffee was already made, and Clara Whitfield was sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of paper in front of her, writing something in a small, precise hand. She looked up when he came in. She didn't startle. "I made a list," she said. He poured coffee. "Of what?" "Everything that needs doing on this property." She slid the paper across the table toward him. "In order of urgency." He looked at the list. It was thorough. It was accurate. It covered things he'd been meaning to get to for 2 years, and things he hadn't consciously noticed needed attention, but which clearly did, now that someone had written them down in plain terms. "You walked the property this morning?" he asked. "Before dawn," she said. "I couldn't sleep past 4. I never could." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "The south fence is worse than I thought yesterday. 3 posts are fully rotted at the base. Another 6 are soft. You'll lose cattle through that line inside of a month if it isn't reset." "I know. And the barn roof isn't just 2 boards. There's a section about 12 feet long on the east pitch where the sheathing has separated underneath. You've probably had water in the loft all fall." "I suspected that." "Did you do anything about it?" He drank his coffee. "That's a no," she said without judgment. She pulled the paper back and looked at it. "If we work the fence line today and tomorrow, and the roof on Wednesday when the temperature comes up a few degrees, we can have the critical repairs done before the next storm system." She glanced up. "Assuming you have the materials." "I have most of them," he said. "I'd need to go down for lumber and nails." "All right." She stood and took her cup to the basin. "What time do we start?" He looked at her back for a moment. This woman 2 weeks off an 11-day journey, making a list of his ranch's failures before sunrise and asking what time they started. "You don't have to do this," he said. She turned around. "I told you last night I earn my days. I'm not comfortable with charity, Mr. Mercer, and I'm not interested in sitting in that back room feeling sorry for myself while you work." She met his gaze steadily. "I also think it's going to take both of us to reset those posts properly, given how frozen the ground is. So what time do we start?" 30 minutes, he said. "Good." She moved past him toward the hall. "I'll be ready in 10. The fence work was hard and cold, and it required the particular kind of focus that leaves no room for anything else, which Caleb suspected was exactly why Clara had put it first on the list. You couldn't think about Chicago, or forged letters, or Jonas Miller's face when you were driving a post into frost-hardened ground, with every pound of your body weight behind the driver, and someone on the other side of the hole keeping the post plumb. They worked without much talking. He'd expected her to flag by mid-morning. She didn't flag. She didn't complain about her hands. Though he could see by the second hour that the driver was raising blisters she wasn't going to mention. When they stopped to warm their hands at the small fire he'd built midway through the line, she examined her palms briefly and then put her gloves back on without comment. "You should wrap those," he said. "They'll harden," she said. "A few days. I have linen in the barn kit." She looked at him for a moment. Then she held out her hands, palms up. He wrapped them. He'd wrapped plenty of field injuries over the years, his own hands a ranch hand he'd employed briefly in the early years after Sarah died. His hands knew the work. But he was aware in a way that was new and slightly inconvenient of the fact that these were her hands specifically, and that wrapping them required holding them, and that she was watching his face while he worked with the particular steady attention she gave to everything. "You did this for someone before," she said. "Ranch work produces injuries," he said. "That's not what I mean." A pause. "You know how to take care of someone. It's still in your hands, even if it's not in your habits." He tied off the wrap and let go. "Post's ready," he said, and went back to work. But she was right, and they both knew it, and it sat between them for the rest of the afternoon, like something that had been named and couldn't be unnamed. By the time they came in at dusk, they'd reset 7 posts and braced 4 more. Caleb's back reminded him he was not 25. He said nothing about it. Clara sat down at the kitchen table and put both wrapped hands flat on the surface and closed her eyes for exactly 10 seconds he counted without intending to, and then opened them and stood up and started on supper. "Sit down," he said. She turned. "You worked all day," he said. "Sit down, I'll cook." She looked at him with an expression he was beginning to be able to read that brief interior consultation, the small verdict. She sat down. He cooked. It was nothing like what she'd made the night before. It was functional food, the way everything he made was functional, but it was hot, and there was enough of it, and he set it in front of her without ceremony and sat down across from her, and they ate. "Tell me about Sarah," she said. He went very still. "You don't have to," she said immediately. "I'm sorry, that was—" "No," he said. The word came out before he'd decided on it. He looked at his plate. Then he looked up. "You see her things, in the house. It would be strange to pretend you don't." A pause. "What do you want to know?" Clara was quiet for a moment, understanding the weight of what he'd just offered. "What was she like?" she asked, gently, the way you ask about something precious. He thought about it honestly, the way he rarely let himself think about it. "Stubborn," he said, "in the best way. The kind of stubborn that holds things together when everything else is pulling them apart." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "She laughed at things I didn't expect. She had opinions about everything, and she didn't wait to be asked before she shared them." A pause. "She made this place feel like somewhere a person was supposed to be, instead of just somewhere a person was." Clara listened. She didn't try to fill the space around his words. "She died in March," he said. "Fever came on fast. 3 days." He stopped. "I was in town when it started. By the time I got back, it was already in the 3rd day, and there was nothing." He stopped again, cleared his throat. "There was nothing by then." "I'm sorry," Clara said. Simply. Not the performed sympathy he'd received for years after the careful condolences from people who didn't know what else to say. Just, "I'm sorry." As if she meant the specific thing and not the general shape of it. 18 years is a long time to be sorry," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." She looked at him directly. "It's also a long time to keep punishing yourself for something you couldn't control." His jaw tightened. "Jonas says something similar," he said. "Jonas is right about that part," she said. "Even if his methods were wrong." He looked at her for a long moment. The fire ticked. The wind moved outside. 18 years of silence pressed at the walls of the cabin, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, the silence didn't win. "You're a very direct person," he said. I was trained out of it for a long time," she said. "By the time I got to Chicago, I'd learned to say everything sideways, to imply and suggest and never quite state." Her voice was even. "Gerald Harmon's office cured me of that permanently. When you watch a man lie to your face and call it clarification often enough, you lose patience for anything but the exact truth." Caleb nodded slowly. He understood that. The specific exhaustion of having watched someone turn reality inside out with words and being expected to nod and accept the inversion. "What happened to him?" he asked. "Harmon, after you left." Something moved in her eyes. "Nothing," she said. "As far as I know. Men like that don't experience consequences. They experience inconveniences, briefly, and then someone else comes along and gets hurt." She looked down at her wrapped hands. "That's actually the part I have the hardest time with. Not what happened to me. What's still happening to someone else who doesn't know yet." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "What did you say his name was?" he said slowly. "The firm, Harmon Investment Group," she said. "On Dearborn Street." She looked up. "Why?" "Because I spent 15 years handling cattle contracts before I stopped dealing with people," he said. "And I still know a lawyer in Salt Lake who handles correspondence cases across the territory." A pause. "Financial fraud isn't local, Clara." If Harmon's moving money across state lines and investment firms do, there are federal channels. She stared at him. I'm not saying there's an easy answer, he said carefully. I'm saying there might be one, if you have documentation. I kept copies, she said quietly. Of everything. Before I left. I have them in the trunk. The air shifted. Why did you keep them? He asked. She met his eyes. Because some part of me knew that running wasn't actually going to be enough, she said. And because those widows he stole from deserved better than me disappearing. Caleb Mercer looked at Clara Whitfield across the kitchen table and felt something shift in his chest. Not the fragile loosening of the last 2 days, but something more solid. Something that had more structure to it. This was not a woman who had arrived at his ranch by accident and was waiting to be rescued. This was a woman who had been carrying loaded ammunition in her trunk for 6 months, waiting for a moment when using it might mean something. After the roof, he said, we'll talk about the documentation. She nodded, one precise controlled nod. They finished supper. Neither of them said anything more that night. But the quiet had changed its quality again, not the quiet of two people avoiding each other, but the quiet of two people with the same thing turning over in their minds. Wednesday brought the temperature up enough to make the roof work possible. Caleb brought the lumber up from the barn, and Clara held the ladder with both wrapped hands, and didn't make a single comment about the height or the cold, or the fact that he was moving across an icy pitch like a man 20 years younger than he'd been moving 2 days ago. She handed materials up when he called for them. She passed nails in exactly the right quantity without being told. When he said move the ladder 3 feet east, she moved it 3 feet east without asking why. After an hour, he called down, "You've done this before." "Roof work," she called up. "Working with someone," he said. "You anticipate." A pause. "My uncle couldn't afford help most summers," she called back. "It was just him and me. You learn to think ahead." He drove the next nail and thought about a girl on an Indiana farm handing nails up a ladder to an uncle who couldn't afford help, and about a woman in a Chicago office keeping copies of fraudulent records in case the moment ever came when they mattered, and about that same woman driving fence posts into frozen Utah ground without complaint. He thought about how people became who they were, the long sequence of small decisions and survived difficulties that shaped a person from the outside in. He thought about what kind of woman arrived at the wrong ranch on a forged letter and within 3 days started fixing it. He came down off the roof at noon and they stood in the yard and looked up at the east pitch together. "Good," she said. "Good," he agreed. They went in for coffee. It was Jonas who arrived 2 days later and broke the equilibrium. Caleb heard the wagon on the ridge road and knew it before it came into the yard, knew the particular rhythm of Jonas's rig, the way his horse favored its left front, and moved accordingly. He came out to the porch and waited. Jonas pulled up and looked at Caleb, and looked at the cabin, and then looked at Caleb again. "I wanted to," he started. "Come in," Caleb said, not warmly, but not the door shut in his face either. Clara was at the kitchen table with papers spread in front of her, the documents from her trunk, the ones she'd been organizing for 2 days with a methodical precision that he'd watched quietly and not interrupted. She looked up when Jonas came in, and her face went carefully neutral. Jonas stopped when he saw the papers. "What's all this?" "Sit down, Jonas," Caleb said. Jonas sat. "She has documentation," Caleb said, "on a man in Chicago who's been stealing from widows through a fraudulent investment scheme. The lawyer in Salt Lake Patterson. You remember him?" Jonas's eyebrows went up. "Tom Patterson, from the land case in '91. He handles federal correspondence now," Caleb said. "I want to know if he'd look at this." Jonas looked at the papers. He looked at Clara. He looked at Caleb. "You've been up here less than a week," Jonas said carefully. "And you're already working," Caleb said. "Yes." A pause that carried 18 years in it. "Is that a problem?" Jonas's face did something complicated. pride and relief and grief all moving through it at once the way light moves through water. "No," he said roughly. "No, it's not a problem." He cleared his throat. "I'll ride to Salt Lake myself if you want. Tom owes me a favor." "I know he does," Caleb said. "That's why I'm asking you." Jonas looked at Clara. The silence between them was its own separate thing, all that weight from the feed store, all that damage done and acknowledged. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "I can't undo what I did. I know that." "No," she said, "you can't. But if I can do something that helps you, these documents could help people who aren't me," she said. "Women who don't have the option of getting on a wagon and going somewhere else." She held his gaze. "If Mr. Patterson thinks there's a case, I'll give him everything. But I need to know it won't just disappear into a desk drawer because Gerald Harmon has friends in the right offices." "Tom Patterson," Jonas said firmly, "does not like men who steal from widows. I can promise you that much." Clara looked at the papers for a moment. Then she gathered a section and held them out to Jonas. He took them. Something passed between all three of them. Not reconciliation exactly, not yet, but the beginning of something that had the shape of shared purpose. The particular bond that forms between people who are doing something that matters together. Caleb walked Jonas out to the wagon. They stood in the yard for a moment, not quite looking at each other. "She's something," Jonas said quietly. "Don't," Caleb said. "I'm not doing anything. I'm observing." "Observe quietly." Jonas almost smiled. He put his foot on the wagon step. "Are you angry at me still?" Caleb looked at the ridgeline, at the gray sky above it, at the world that had looked the same for 18 years and somehow looked fractionally different today. "Yes," he said, "but less than yesterday." "That's progress," Jonas said. "Don't push it." Jonas climbed up and took the reins. "I'll be back in a week with word from Patterson." "Jonas," the old man looked down. "Thank you," Caleb said, "for being stubborn enough." He paused. "Even when you were wrong about how." Jonas's face did that complicated thing again. He nodded once hard and turned the wagon down the ridge road. Caleb stood in the yard until the sound of it faded. Poor. That evening Clara was quiet in a way that was different from her usual quiet. She sat with a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking and looked at the table, and he could see something working in her. Not grief exactly, but the emotional aftermath of a decision made and handed over. The documents were gone now out of her hands and in Jonas's, and that meant a part of her that had been holding on very tightly for a very long time had let go. He didn't say anything about it. He just put more coffee in her cup without being asked and sat down across from her. After a long time she said, "What if it doesn't work? What if Patterson says there's nothing to be done?" "Then we find another way," Caleb said. She looked up at that "we." He'd used it without thinking. It had just arrived the way her name had arrived in his mouth that first night before the decision, before the deliberation. He didn't take it back. She looked at him for a moment with those direct, exhausted, increasingly familiar eyes. "You know," she said quietly, "when I got on that wagon in Chicago, I thought the best I could hope for was somewhere to disappear into." A pause. "I didn't think I'd end up somewhere I might actually want to be." The fire burned. The wind moved. The cabin held the warmth in the way it always had, though it felt less like a closed fist about it now, and more like something that understood what warmth was for. Caleb Mercer looked at Clara Whitfield and felt the thing he'd been refusing to name for 6 days press close against the walls he'd built around it. He didn't name it yet. He wasn't ready. But he stopped pushing it away. The week that followed moved differently than any week Caleb could remember on Mercer Ridge. Not easier, not simpler, just differently. Like a clock that had been running at the wrong speed for 18 years had quietly, without announcement, found the right rhythm. He noticed it in small things first. The way he stopped calculating days. The way supper became a time he moved toward instead of through. The way the cabin, which had echoed for 2 decades, seemed to have found its proper acoustic again, Not loud, not crowded, just inhabited in the way a place was supposed to be inhabited. Clara settled into the work, the way she settled into everything without ceremony, without asking for acknowledgement, with a competence that was starting to feel less like a surprise and more like a fact about the world he now simply knew. She fixed the soft boards under the east window. She reorganized the larder with a logic he couldn't have articulated, but which made everything easier to find. She figured out the particular temperament of his wood stove, the way it needed the damper positioned precisely, or it burned too hot and wasted wood without being told purely through observation over 3 days of mornings. And she asked questions. Not the intrusive kind, the careful kind, the kind that indicated she was paying attention and wanted to understand. "How many head are you running?" she asked one morning. 62, he said. Down from 90. I stopped expanding when I stopped seeing the point. She absorbed that without comment. "Is 62 sustainable?" she asked. "Comfortably. If the south pasture grass comes back strong in spring." "It will," she said. "The soil's good down there. I can see it in how the frost sits on it differently than the north slope." She poured coffee. "You could run 80 easily. Maybe 90 again if you added another water line from the upper creek." He looked at her over his cup. "You're planning," he said. She met his eyes. "I notice things," she said carefully. I'm not making assumptions about what happens here. I just see what the land can do." He didn't tell her she was right. He didn't need to. She could see it in his face, and they both knew it, and they let it rest there between them, without either of them picking it up and doing something reckless with it. That was the careful dance of those days. Both of them aware, both of them not saying, both of them working, eating, talking about practical things, and feeling the impractical thing growing steadily larger in the room every single evening. It broke open on the 9th night, and it broke open the way things do when they've been pressed too long suddenly, and without warning, and from an unexpected direction. He'd been in the barn late checking on a cow that had been off her feed for 2 days. He came in past 9 o'clock to find Clara not in the kitchen and not in the back room, but sitting on the floor of the front room with her back against the wall and Sarah's needlework in her hands. She wasn't doing anything with it, just holding it, looking at it. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up. She didn't startle, but something in her face moved, a flash of something that might have been guilt, which she rapidly controlled. "I should have asked," she said immediately. She held it out toward him. "I was dusting the frame and it came off the hook and She stopped. "I looked at it. I'm sorry." He crossed the room and took it from her. He looked at it, the small, stitched landscape, the careful needlework, the particular blue of thread Sarah had chosen for the sky. He'd walked past it every day for 18 years and stopped seeing it the way you stopped seeing the walls of a room you'd lived in too long. In Clara's hands, he'd seen it again. "She did this the first winter we were here," he said. "Said the cabin needed something that wasn't practical." He looked at it for another moment. "It's the only thing in this house that isn't practical." "It's beautiful," Clara said simply. He hung it back on the wall. He stood there with his back to her for a moment, and he was aware that she'd stood up from the floor and was somewhere close behind him, and he was aware that the room was very quiet, and it was very late, and they'd been living in close proximity for 9 days, and that had its own particular gravity. "Caleb," she said. He turned around. She was closer than he expected. Not improper. Nothing calculated in it. Just the natural geography of a small room, and two people who had stopped keeping exaggerated distance from each other without noticing when that had changed. "I need to tell you something," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands he glanced down, and she was holding them still at her sides with a deliberateness that told him the stillness was chosen. "I've been trying to figure out whether to say it for several days, and I've decided that not saying it is a kind of dishonesty, and I'm done with dishonesty." He waited. "I know I came here on false terms," she said. "I know what I am in this house, a mistake that landed on your doorstep. I know you've been kind because you're a decent man, and the situation required it, and I'm not confusing kindness for anything larger than it is." She met his eyes fully. "But I want to say clearly, so there's no ambiguity between us, I'm aware that something is happening here. between us. And I'm not going to pretend I'm not aware of it because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve someone performing obliviousness. A pause. I don't know what to do with it. I'm not asking you to do anything with it. I couldn't keep not saying it. Caleb looked at her for a long time. No, he said finally. She blinked, just once quickly. I don't mean... He started and stopped. And this was where Caleb Mercer's entire lifetime of choosing silence over expression became a direct liability because he had something to say and no practiced way to say it. He tried again. I mean, no, you're not a mistake that landed on my doorstep. That's how it started. That's not what it is now. Clara was very still. I don't know what to do with it either, he said. I want to be honest about that. I closed this part of myself off a long time ago, and I'm not certain how much of it still works right. He held her gaze. But I'm aware of it too, and I'm not willing to pretend I'm not now that you've been honest about it. The fire ticked. Neither of them moved. All right, she said finally. Soft. Just all right. All right, he said. They stood there for another moment in the particular charged quiet of two people who have said the important thing and are now absorbing the fact that they said it. Then Clara said, I think we should both go to sleep, in a voice that was almost entirely steady. Yes, he agreed. She went down the hall. He stood in the front room with Sarah's needlework on the wall and his own heartbeat, which was doing something it hadn't done in 18 years. He stayed there until it settled. It took a while. Jonas came back on the 8th day, not the 7th, and he came back faster and with a different energy than Caleb expected, the wagon moving at a clip, his big body forward on the bench, the particular posture of a man carrying news that won't wait. Caleb was in the yard when he pulled in. Clara came out to the porch. Jonas climbed down and looked at both of them and said, Tom Patterson wants to see the rest of the documents. Clara's hand went to the porch railing. All of them? Caleb asked. All of them. Jonas was breathing slightly fast from the drive. He looked at what I brought him for 2 hours, called in a colleague. They've been in contact with a federal marshal's office in Chicago for 6 months on a separate matter involving missing funds from pension accounts. He looked at Clara directly. The accounts they've been tracking belong to Harmon Investment Group Miss Whitfield. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. They already knew, Clara said. Her voice was very quiet. They knew something was wrong, Jonas said. They didn't have documentation of the mechanism, the actual paperwork showing how the transfers were routed. He paused. Tom says what you have could be exactly what they've needed. Clara turned and went back into the cabin. Caleb looked at Jonas. Jonas looked at Caleb. Give her a minute, Caleb said. Is she all right? She's been carrying those documents for 6 months, Caleb said, thinking no one cared, thinking she left, and no one was doing anything about it. He turned toward the cabin. Give her a minute. He went inside. She was standing at the kitchen table, with both hands flat on the surface, the same position she'd been in the morning, after they came back from Clearwater, and she was breathing in a way that was very controlled and very deliberate. Clara, he said. I'm fine, she said. Her voice was not quite even. You don't have to be fine right now. I know. She pressed her palms harder against the table. It's just, I left. I thought I was leaving, and it was going to matter to no one, and nothing was going to change, and those women were still going to... She stopped. She collected herself with visible effort. I thought I was just running away. You were surviving, Caleb said. That's not the same thing. She looked up at him. You kept the documents, he said. You didn't throw them away when it would have been easier and safer to throw them away. You kept them because some part of you refused to let it be over. He met her eyes. That's not running away. That's waiting for the right moment. She looked at him for a long beat. Then, without preamble or performance, Clara Whitfield sat down in the kitchen chair and put her face in her hands. Not crying, just pressing them there, just allowing herself 30 seconds of not holding everything up. He sat down across from her, And he did not say anything, and he did not look away. And after 30 seconds, she lifted her face, and her eyes were bright but dry, and she squared her shoulders in the way she squared them when she'd decided something. "I need to go to Salt Lake," she said, "to meet with Patterson in person." "I know," he said. "I need to give him everything and make a formal statement." A pause. "It might take more than a day." "We'll go together," he said. She looked at him carefully. "You don't have to." "The cattle will be fine for 2 days," he said. "The fence is repaired. The roof is repaired." He held her gaze. "You shouldn't walk into a lawyer's office in a strange city alone. Not for something like this." She searched his face for a moment. "All right," she said. The same 2 words as the night before. But they meant something different this time, and they both knew it. Yud. They left for Salt Lake the following morning and arrived by evening. Tom Patterson was a thin man of 50, with the focused eyes of someone who had spent decades reading things people tried to hide. He shook Clara's hand first, which Caleb noted, and he sat across from her at his desk and listened to her account with a legal pad and a pencil, and the complete attention of a man who already believed what he was hearing. She was extraordinary. Caleb sat to the side and watched her lay out 18 months of Gerald Harmon's financial fraud with a precision and clarity that transformed her from a woman who'd escaped a bad situation into a witness who'd been methodically gathering a case. She produced documents in sequence. She explained the routing structure. She named accounts, dates, transfer amounts. She described conversations she'd had with Harmon verbatim, with the recall of someone who'd been rehearsing them in her memory for months. Patterson's pencil moved steadily. When she finished, Patterson sat back and looked at her for a moment. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "how long did you work for Harmon?" 3 years, she said. "And you kept copies of these records at personal risk to yourself for 6 months while traveling to another territory?" "Yes." "Why?" She didn't hesitate. "Because someone had to," she said, "and I was the only one who could." Patterson looked at Caleb briefly, then back at Clara. "I'm going to need you available for correspondence over the coming months," he said. "Possibly a return visit if the federal case proceeds to charges." He leaned forward. "This is serious, Miss Whitfield. Depending on what the marshal's office in Chicago has on their end, this could result in criminal charges against Harmon and potentially several associates." "I understand," she said. "The defense will attempt to discredit you," he said, not unkindly, directly, the way she appreciated being spoken to. "They'll look for anything they can use." "Let them look," she said. Patterson almost smiled. "Where can we reach you?" Clara opened her mouth. She stopped. Caleb watched her realize she didn't have an answer to that question. She had traveled 11 days to a ranch that wasn't hers, on a letter that wasn't real, and she'd been there 9 days, and she had no address to give, because she had no address anywhere in the world at the moment. "Mercer Ridge," Caleb said. "Outside Clearwater." He gave the road and the distance. "Send correspondence to the Clearwater Post in my name. I'll have it." Clara looked at him. Patterson wrote it down. He didn't ask about the arrangement. He was a lawyer, not a gossip. They left the office as the city was going dark around them, and they stood on the street for a moment in the particular dazed quiet of people who have just done something that cannot be undone. "It's real now," she said. "It was always real," he said. "Now other people know." She looked down the unfamiliar street. "He's going to know I did this. Harmon. Eventually." "Eventually," Caleb agreed. "He has money and connections, and he will make things very unpleasant." "I know." She turned and looked at him directly. "I should tell you that. In case it creates complications for you, for the ranch. Mercer Ridge is your address now because of me." "Clara," he said. She waited. "I know what I said," he said. "I said it on purpose." She looked at him for a long moment with those eyes that saw things and assembled them and drew true conclusions. And then something happened in her face that he hadn't seen before. Not the controlled composure, not the measured expression, but something underneath all of it, something younger and less defended and real in a way the composure only gestured at. "Okay," she said, barely above a whisper. They found a boarding house for the night. 2 separate rooms. The proprietress, a Mrs. Alcott, made no comment about the arrangement and asked no questions, which was either tact or exhaustion, and either way was exactly what both of them needed. Caleb lay on his back in the dark of the unfamiliar room and looked at a ceiling he didn't know and thought about what he'd done. He'd given his address, his name, his location, to a federal case in Chicago involving a powerful man who did not handle consequences gracefully. He'd done it in front of a lawyer who had written it down in ink. He'd done it without hesitation. 18 years ago, he had stopped making decisions that tied him to the future. Had stopped doing anything that implied the future was a place worth showing up for. Had reduced his life to the radius of the ridge and the routine and the long, slow gray wait for whatever came at the end of it. He had just handed a federal attorney his address in ink. He thought about Clara's face on that street. The thing underneath the composure, the unguarded thing that only lasted a second before she caught it and brought everything back to order. He thought about Jonas saying, "You were already dead, Caleb. You just hadn't stopped breathing." He thought about the coffee that was ready every morning before he was. The list of repairs in precise handwriting. The wrapped hands on a fence post. The 30 seconds with her face in her palms. The way she said, "okay," like it was the answer to a question she'd stopped expecting anyone to ask. He was not a man who said things easily. He was not a man who reached toward things. He had not been that man in a very long time. But sometime between the 8th and 9th day, lying in a strange bed in Salt Lake City, Caleb Mercer understood that the version of himself that was only surviving had met its expiration date. He didn't know what came next. He knew for the first time in 18 years that he wanted to find out. They drove back to Mercer Ridge the next morning, mostly in silence. But it was the comfortable kind, the kind between people who have been through something together and don't need to narrate it to know they both lived it. Halfway up the Ridge Road, Clara said, "My month." He glanced at her. "What? You told me I could stay 1 month," she said. "Not as a bride, not as a mistake, just 2 people surviving together." She looked at the road ahead. "My month ends in 11 days. He kept his eyes on the horses. "And," he said. "I'm asking what happens in 11 days, she said. Steady, direct. No performance in it. Just the question. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the ridge road climbed and the air got colder and the cabin came into view against the gray sky. He pulled the wagon to a stop in the yard, set the brake, sat for a moment with the reins in his hands, looking at the cabin he'd lived in alone for 18 years. "I think," he said carefully, "that in 11 days we both decide whether we want to keep going." He turned and looked at her fully. Not because of a letter, not because of a mistake, but because we've looked at each other clearly without any of the original story attached and made an actual choice. Clara looked back at him with the same directness. "And if we do?" she asked. "Then we figure out what that looks like," he said. "Together, as 2 people who know exactly what they're getting into." She was quiet for a moment. Something moved through her face, not the controlled composure, not the defended thing, but the real thing underneath the one that had shown itself for a second on the street in Salt Lake and was showing itself again now. "That's the most honest proposal I've ever heard," she said. "It's not a proposal," he said. "It's an invitation. What's the difference?" He thought about it. "A proposal assumes the answer," he said. "An invitation waits for one." Clara Whitfield looked at Caleb Mercer on a wagon bench on Mercer Ridge in the late October cold. And something in her that had been braced for a very long time braced against Chicago and Gerald Harmon, and forged letters and wrong arrivals, and all the ways the world had recently failed her. That thing eased. Not gone, not naive, just eased. "Ask me again in 11 days, she said. "I will," he said. They climbed down from the wagon. They went inside. The cabin was exactly as they'd left it, warm from the banked fire, the needlework on the wall, 2 cups still on the table from breakfast. Caleb looked at those 2 cups. He thought about how long the table had only needed one. He thought about 11 days. The 11 days did not pass quietly. Caleb had half expected them to have imagined some kind of suspended peace, a held breath before the question came due. Instead, the days arrived fast and full, and demanded things from both of them in ways that left no room for the careful emotional distance they'd been maintaining. On the 3rd day after Salt Lake, a letter came from Patterson's office. Not correspondence, an actual urgent letter hand-delivered by a writer from Clearwater who'd been paid extra to make the climb. Patterson had been in contact with the federal marshal's office in Chicago. Gerald Harmon had learned through channels Patterson couldn't yet identify that documentation had been submitted against him. He had already retained 3 lawyers and was making inquiries about the source. Clara read the letter at the kitchen table. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at it the way she looked at things she was deciding how to feel about. "He knows it came from someone internal," she said. "He'll know it was me." "He probably already suspects," Caleb said. "You were the one with access." "He'll try to move against it," she said. "Try to discredit the documents. He has people who can manufacture counter-documentation." "Patterson knows that," Caleb said. "He said so." "Knowing and stopping it are different things." She pressed her fingers flat against the letter. "I need to write to Patterson today. There are 3 additional records I didn't include in the original submission. I wasn't sure they were relevant, but if Harmon is already moving..." "Write the letter," Caleb said. "I'll ride down to Clearwater and have it sent express." She looked up at him. "Now," he said. She was already moving to find paper. He watched her write fast and precise, the handwriting of someone thinking clearly under pressure. And he thought about the woman who had stepped off a wagon 17 days ago with exhausted eyes and a forged letter and no ground to stand on anywhere in the world. He thought about how different the quality of her motion was now. Not relaxed, Clara Whitfield was not a relaxed person, and he suspected she never had been, but grounded. Like someone who had found their footing and was working from it. She sealed the letter and handed it to him. "Be careful on the grade," she said. "It's been icing overnight." "I know the grade," he said. "I know you know it," she said, meeting his eyes briefly. "I'm saying it anyway." He took the letter and went. Riding down the ridge, he turned that small exchange over in his mind. Be careful on the grade. 4 words. The most ordinary 4 words in the world. The kind of words that passed between people who had a stake in each other's safe return. He'd had no one to say those words to him in 18 years. He hadn't understood until this moment how much that silence had weighed. On the 6th day, Jonas came back up the ridge uninvited, which was unusual even for Jonas, whose visits had always been carefully timed to avoid feeling like intrusions. He arrived mid-morning with the expression of a man who had news and wasn't certain how it was going to land. Caleb let him in. Clara was in the barn, checking on the off-feed cow who had finally improved 2 days prior. "Patterson contacted me directly this morning," Jonas said, sitting down heavily at the table. "Through a rider." "I got his letter on the 3rd day," Caleb said. "This is different from the letter." Jonas looked at him steadily. "He's heard back from the federal marshal's office. They've been building a case against Harmon for 14 months. They have testimony from 4 former employees, none of whom had documentation, just accounts of what they witnessed." He paused. "What Clara has is the missing piece. The paper trail that turns witness accounts into provable fraud." Caleb set his coffee down. "How big is the case?" he asked. 41 victims identified so far," Jonas said. "Widows, retirees, a church fund in Indiana. Total losses over $60,000 across 8 years. He looked at Caleb with the gravity of a man delivering a number that has human faces behind it. "Patterson says with Clara's documentation, the federal prosecutor's office in Chicago will almost certainly move to charges within 60 days. The back door opened. Clara came in from the barn, pulling her gloves off, and she read both their faces in the time it took her to cross the kitchen. "Tell me," she said. Jonas told her. She stood very still through all of it. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. 41, she said. That they've identified, Jonas said carefully. Patterson believes the actual number is higher. It's higher, she said. Her voice was flat and certain. He ran 3 separate fund structures. The marshal's office is only looking at 2. She pulled out the chair across from Jonas and sat down. I need to write another letter. Clara, Jonas started. I know the 3rd structure, she said. I processed some of those transfers myself before I understood what I was looking at. If they don't know about it, they're going to miss a 1/3 of the victims. She was already looking toward the paper on the side table. 41 becomes 60 at minimum. Jonas looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Clara. This woman who had every reason to give what she'd given and step back and protect herself, and who was instead leaning further in because 60 people were more than 41, and she knew something that mattered. Write the letter, he said quietly. She wrote for 40 minutes without stopping. The kitchen was silent except for the scratch of the pen and the fire and the occasional sound of Jonas shifting in his chair. When she finished, she read it back to herself, lips moving slightly, made 2 corrections, and handed it to Jonas. This needs to go to Patterson today, she said. Not express, in person. Can you go to Salt Lake? Jonas blinked. Today. If he gets this tomorrow, it gives them an additional week before they file, she said. That week matters for building the 3rd structure into the charges. Jonas looked at the letter. He looked at Clara. Something moved through his old face, complex and layered, and at the bottom of it something very close to awe. I'll leave within the hour, he said. He left within the hour, within. Clara stood at the window and watched his wagon go down the ridge road. Caleb stood beside her. Not close enough to touch, close enough that the absence of touch was itself a kind of presence. You know what this means, she said. When this goes to charges. When Harmon's name is in federal proceedings. It means it's real, Caleb said. It means it's public, she said. My name will be attached to it. The woman who filed the documentation. She turned to look at him. People will know where to find me. People who work for him. People who'd prefer this not happen. People already know where to find you, Caleb said. Patterson has the address. I know. She held his gaze. I'm asking if that concerns you. Yes, he said directly. It concerns me. That's different from wanting you to do anything differently. She studied his face for a moment in that careful way she had. You're not afraid, she said. You're alert. There's a difference. I've been alone on this ridge for 18 years, he said. I stopped being afraid of much around year 4. Alert, I can manage. Something shifted in her expression. Caleb. What? Thank you, she said. Not for... She paused, finding precision. Not for the practical things. For not making me feel like a problem you're managing. He looked at her directly. You're not a problem, he said. You've never been a problem. You were a surprise. That's a different category entirely. She almost smiled. The real one. The one that was still rare enough to register every time. 10. The 11th day came on a Thursday. It came quietly. No letter from Patterson, no wagon on the ridge road, no event to fill it with external noise. Just a clear, cold morning with frost on the ground and the particular quality of autumn light that exists for about a week in the Utah mountains before winter makes its final commitment. Clara was at the kitchen table when he came out. Coffee made. But she wasn't reading or writing or doing anything with her hands. She was just sitting looking at the table, and he understood immediately that she was waiting. He poured his coffee. He sat down across from her. They looked at each other. 11 days, she said. 11 days, he said. Neither of them reached for anything else to say first. They'd both earned the right to the directness. I want to stay, she said. Not hurried, not soft. Just the clean, true fact of it. I want to stay, and I want to be clear that I'm saying that knowing full well what this place is, and what you are, and what the work is. I'm not saying it because I have nowhere else to go. I have options now. Patterson's office will have work for me, correspondence and document organization, he said as much. I could go to Salt Lake. I could build something there. She met his eyes. I'm not choosing to stay because I have no choice. I'm choosing to stay because I want this. This place. This work. She paused, one beat. You. Caleb was quiet. He'd prepared for this moment in the way he prepared for things practically honestly without pretense. He'd thought about what he wanted to say and whether the words he had were adequate to the thing he was trying to say with them. They probably weren't. They were what he had. I spent 18 years, he said, making sure I didn't want anything. Because wanting things meant risking things, and I'd lost the only thing that had ever mattered to me, and I'd made myself a promise not out loud, not in words, but the kind of promise you make in the deepest part of yourself, when the pain is bad enough that I would never be in that position again. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. I was very good at keeping that promise. I got so good at it that I stopped noticing I was keeping it. It just became what I was. Clara was very still across the table. And then you got off a wagon in my yard, he said, and told me you'd come a very long way and you believed I'd sent for you. A pause. And I thought I remember thinking, what has Jonas done? And underneath that something else. Something I didn't look at for several days. He looked up. The thing underneath was, why didn't I think of this myself? Clara's breath caught, just slightly. I'm not the man I was at 35, he said. I'm not even the man I should have been at 50. 18 years of deliberate isolation takes things from a person. I know that. I know I'm not easy. I know this place is hard, and the winters are long, and I have habits that are going to be irritating to live alongside indefinitely. He held her gaze. But I am done keeping that promise to myself. And I would like... He stopped. He started again. I would very much like you to stay. Not for a month. Not on terms. Just stay. The fire ticked. Clara looked at him across the table for a long, full moment, and he watched all the careful architecture of her composure do something he hadn't seen it do before. Not fall. Not crack, but simply become unnecessary. Like a door that had been held shut against weather, finding itself in still air and letting go. Caleb, she said. Clara. Ask me, she said. Soft. Just ask me. Will you stay? He said. Yes, she said. Simply. Completely. Without qualification or condition. The word settled into the kitchen like something that had been trying to find its way there for a long time. Calmed. Jonas came back from Salt Lake 2 days later with a letter from Patterson and the expression of a man who was going to work very hard not to say I told you so. Patterson's letter confirmed that the federal prosecutor's office had received all documentation that the third fund structure Clara had identified had been verified independently against the marshal's existing evidence, and that a grand jury hearing was scheduled for the following month. Clara would need to provide a sworn written statement. Patterson would send the forms and might be called to Chicago for testimony if the case proceeded to trial. She read the letter at the table while Jonas sat across from her, and Caleb stood at the stove and pretended to be interested in the coffee. The third structure, she said, looking up. They verified it. Tom said your records were more complete than anything they'd developed themselves, Jonas said. He glanced at the letter. He said, and I'm quoting Miss Whitfield's documentation, represents the kind of meticulous record-keeping that suggests she knew on some level that this day would come. Clara set the letter down. I didn't know, she said quietly. I just couldn't stand the idea of it disappearing, of it being like it never happened. Well, Jonas said, it didn't disappear. She looked at the letter for another moment. Then she looked at Jonas directly, the first time Caleb noted that she'd looked at him without any layer of guardedness between them. Thank you, she said, for going to Salt Lake, for going the first time, and for going again. Jonas blinked. He hadn't expected it. I owed you more than a trip to Salt Lake, he said gruffly. Yes, she said. You did, but this is a start. Jonas let out a short surprise sound that was almost a laugh. He looked at Caleb over the table with an expression that said, "She's something," the same thing he'd said in the yard 8 days ago. This time, Caleb didn't tell him not to. "There's something else," Jonas said, reaching into his coat. He produced a smaller envelope and set it on the table. "From Tom. Personal note." Clara opened it. She read it. Her expression shifted in a way that was hard to read, several things happening at once, none of them simple. "What is it?" Caleb asked. She looked up. "Patterson wants to know if I'd consider a formal arrangement," she said, "as a corresponding consultant on financial documentation cases. He has 3 other pending matters where the evidence is, he says, structurally similar, meaning fraudulent investment schemes with manipulated paper trails." She set the note down. He'd pay for the correspondence work and travel when necessary. The kitchen was quiet. "That's legitimate work," Caleb said. "Good work." "Yes," she said. She was watching his face carefully. "It would mean being away sometimes, when cases require testimony, when Patterson needs me in Salt Lake or potentially elsewhere." A pause. "I told you I wasn't looking to be managed. I'm also not looking to be kept." "I know that," he said. "I want to know that you know that," she said. "Going forward, whatever this is, whatever we're building here, I need it to be clear that I'm a person with work of my own. That matters to me." He looked at her across the kitchen, this woman who had arrived with nothing, and was now being asked to do the precise work she'd been trained for, the work that had nearly destroyed her, and had also ultimately been the weapon she'd carried until it mattered. "Write back to Patterson today," he said. "Tell him yes." Clara looked at him for a moment. "You're sure?" she said. "You asked me in the yard whether I know who you are," he said. "I know who you are. A man who doesn't know who you are would tell you to turn that letter down." He held her gaze. "I'm not that man." Something in her face became very quiet and very full at the same time. "No," she said. "You're not." Jonas stood up from the table loudly, in the manner of a man who recognizes he is in the middle of something that doesn't need an audience. "I'll see myself out," he said. "Jonas," Caleb said. The old man stopped at the door. "We're going to need a witness," Caleb said, "when the time comes, for the paperwork." Jonas went very still. Then he turned around slowly and looked at Clara, who was looking at Caleb, who was looking at Jonas, with the expression of a man who had said what he meant and didn't require it repeated. "I'll be available," Jonas said. His voice was rough in the way voices got rough when the thing happening was too large for the normal register. "Whenever you need me, I'll be available." He left. The door closed. Caleb and Clara sat across from each other at the table in the cabin on Mercer Ridge in the late autumn morning, and the fire burned, and the frost sat on the ground outside, and all 18 years of silence had finally been replaced by something that knew what to do with itself. "Paperwork," she said. "It's practical," he said. "It's very you," she said. And this time, the almost smile became the real one, full and unguarded, and lit from somewhere deep inside her. The one he'd only seen in pieces until now, assembled at last into its complete form. He looked at it for a moment. He let himself look at it. "Is that a yes?" he asked. "You said you'd ask me in 11 days, she said. "It's been 13. "I was working up to it." "Caleb Mercer working up to something," she said. "I'll note the date." Clara. "Yes," she said. The same word she'd said 2 days ago at this same table, with the same completeness, the same total absence of reservation. "That is a yes." He reached across the table. He put his hand over hers, not dramatically, not with any gesture larger than the thing itself, and she turned her hand over and held on, and they stayed like that for a long, quiet moment in the kitchen, where 2 cups had been on the table every morning for 13 days. Outside, the ridge held them. The mountain held the ridge. The cold, clear air carried the smell of coming winter, real winter, the deep and serious kind. And inside the cabin was the warmth of a stove that had always burned for one and now burned for 2. 18 years is a long time to wait for your life to find its way back to you. But the mistake that brought Clara Whitfield to the wrong ranch on a forged letter was the most honest thing that had ever happened to either of them. And Mercer Ridge, which had been a place a man went to disappear, became at last the place where two people broken by different things chose each other clearly on purpose, with full knowledge of the cost. And that, in the end, was the only kind of love worth keeping.